Welcome to the Tobacco Online Policy Seminar TOPS. Thank you for joining us today. I'm C. Shang, an Associate Professor at Ohio State University. TOPS is organized by Mike Peskov at the Georgia State University, Michael Darden at Johns Hopkins University, Jamie Hartman-Boyce at the University of Oxford, and me. The seminar will be 1 hour with questions from the moderator and discussant. The audience may pose questions and comments in the Q&A panel, and the moderator will draw from those questions and comments in conversation with the presenter. Please review the guidelines on tobaccopolicy.org for acceptable comments. Please keep the comments professional and related to the research being discussed. Comments that meet the seminar series guidelines will be shared with the presenter afterwards, even if they are not read aloud. Your comments are very much appreciated. This presentation is being video recorded and will be made available along with presentation slides on the TOPS website, tobaccopolicy.org. I will turn the presentation over to today's moderator, Mike Peskov from Georgia State University, to introduce our speaker.
Today, we continue our summer-fall 2023 season with the single paper presentation by Megan Piper entitled Real-World Impact of 3 Alternative Nicotine Delivery Products on Combustible Cigarette Use. This presentation was selected via a competitive review process by submission through the TOPS website. Dr. Piper is a professor in the University of Wisconsin Department of Medicine and a director of research at the University of Wisconsin Center for Tobacco Research and Intervention. She's the former president of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, and in 2022, she was named a SR&T Fellow, having also received the 2014 SR&T Russell Jarvett Young Investigator Award for her contributions to the field. Dr. Piper's research focuses on understanding and treating tobacco dependence among people who smoke and people who use e-cigarettes, with an additional focus on addressing issues of smoking-related health inequality based on race, sexual and gender minority status, and mental illness. Our discussant today is Bukola Usadami, an assistant professor of public health at Purdue University. Dr. Megan Piper, thank you for presenting for us today.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. Allow me to share my screen and we'll get started. All right, are you seeing the proper screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, so let's dive in first. I want to start with the acknowledgements. My co-authors, Doug Jorenby, Tanya Schlamm, and Eric Donnie on this project. Note the funding came from the National Cancer Institute, and this is content is solely the views and opinions of the authors and doesn't reflect the views of NIH or the FDA. I don't have any conflict. None of the authors have any conflicts to report. Specifically with regard to disclosures, my work has been funded for the last 10 years by the National Institutes of Health and the University of Wisconsin. I've received no funding from any tobacco, e-cigarette, or pharmaceutical industry, and I have no other financial interest to disclose. All right, so let's get into this. Everybody on this call knows that we have this significant public health need to reduce commercial combustible tobacco use, especially cigarette use, because it's the leading preventable cause of death and disease in the United States, and it's killing more than 8 million people in the world every year. Cigarette smoking is definitely the most common form of cigarette or of tobacco, commercial tobacco use, and represents the biggest public health threat. I want to note here that I'm going to be talking about tobacco and cigarettes, and in this discussion, I'm going to be referring explicitly to commercial tobacco use, not to any sort of ceremonial or traditional tobacco use. So in addressing this public health need, there's lots of different public health strategies, right? Different people are working on different areas. We're working on prevention, we're working on taxation and pricing, cessation and regulatory activities to try to reduce cigarette use in the United States and throughout the world. So I'm going to focus on this last two, the cessation and regulatory strategies that we have at our disposal. So let's start with cessation strategies. So we know that there are lots of different ways to help people quit smoking. There's medications, there's counseling, but we also know that even with this evidence-based treatment, only about 1 in 5 people who try to make a quit attempt using these interventions are actually able to sustain their abstinence. So if we break that down, it tends to be in sort of two different groups, right? The medications and the counseling. So let's take a look at each of these different interventions individually for a moment. Pharmacotherapies tend to be nicotine agonists, right? Nicotine replacements, varenicline, bupropion. They're focused on sort of doing something that's similar to what nicotine would do in the brain, and thereby reducing abstinence-based withdrawal, reducing cravings, and also reduces the rewarding value of nicotine if you already have some nicotine agonist in the system. So that's sort of the mechanism via which pharmacotherapies tend to work. It's the withdrawal suppression, sort of the replacement of a different kind of nicotine. Counseling tends to focus on developing coping skills and social support, right? Those are the things that have been shown from the 2000 and 2008 Public Health Service Guideline to be the effective elements of a counseling intervention. And so counseling with respect to coping skills, it's avoiding smoking cues and contexts, limiting alcohol consumption, developing strategies to cope with negative affect and craving. Social support tends to happen as part of the counseling encounter, but it can also encourage people to get social support in other places. But even with these two very effective interventions, medication and counseling, which again, the Public Health Service Guidelines shown are more effective when they are combined, we're still missing something because only 1 in 5 people are able to sustain long-term abstinence. So what kind of elements or components of interventions might we be missing that might help people stop smoking cigarettes? One thing we could think about is going back, right? Going back to go forward and thinking about some of our historical knowledge about addiction. And a lot of that comes from research around classical conditioning, right? The notion that if you repeatedly pair an unconditioned stimulus like nicotine, right? So you get the same results with nicotine in the brain with a conditioned stimulus. So this would be a behavior or a cue that's always associated with smoking. When you keep putting those two things together, those drug-associated cues, those conditioned stimuli, actually start to become rewarding in and of themselves. They acquire hedonic and motivational significance, and they become conditioned reinforcers. So what that means is when people smoke repeatedly, then all of those smoking cues, the lighting the cigarette, the smoke off the end of the cigarette, the feeling of the inhale, the throat hit of the nicotine, the taste, the contexts within which they always deliver the drug, these start to become conditioned reinforcers and are rewarding in and of themselves. And there is significant animal literature, human literature to support this notion of the cues becoming conditioned reinforcers. But again, as I talked about earlier, when we try to help people quit smoking and we address cues, we tend to do things like avoid cues to smoke, avoid being around other people who smoke, or we try to offer sort of a substitute cue, some sort of hand to mouth, sucking on a straw, chewing gum for an oral stimulus. But those cues, again, are so very distinct from the conditioned reinforced cues that they tend not to be particularly effective. So the question becomes, are we adequately addressing the conditioned reinforcement of smoking-related cues and their ability to sustain smoking behavior? Is there something else we could be doing? And so that leads us to look at some of the regulatory strategies and tools that are provided by those regulatory strategies. So in the United States, one of the regulatory strategies that the FDA has focused on is regulating nicotine per se. Nicotine's the addictive agent in cigarettes and all tobacco products. That is what sustains use. It's the nicotine that results in neuromodulation that then produces withdrawal symptoms. And so that's been the focus for the FDA on their regulation. So they've had two different approaches that focus on nicotine. And one is to permit the sale of nicotine delivery systems that prevent a modified risk. So this is an e-cigarette, something that's still giving the nicotine, but with a somewhat modified risk, but in some ways with similar cues. The other product that they're offering or the other regulatory strategy that's being worked toward is to reduce the nicotine content that's available in combustible cigarettes to non-addictive levels. So using very low nicotine cigarettes as being a product that would be allowed to be on the market because those would not sustain addiction. They would not provide sufficient nicotine dosing. So with those two alternative products, we have some opportunities to examine the role of behavior and cue conditioning. So with very low nicotine cigarettes, again, they're delivering very minimal nicotine, but they have identical cues and behavioral experiences to smoking a conventional or usual brand cigarette, right? You still have to light it, you still have the hand to mouth, the inhale is the same, and you have the visual, the sensory. You have to note, though, you don't get the same throat hit because that's driven by the nicotine itself. But really, it's as close to smoking a cigarette as you can get without actually having the nicotine delivered to the brain. E-cigarettes are also an alternate product. They do deliver nicotine, and they also have some similar cues, right? You still have the hand to mouth, you're still inhaling. You have vapor, which is not the same as smoke, and it's not necessarily coming off the end of the device. But there's a lot of similar components to it. But there's some differences, right? Like you don't have to light your e-cigarette and things like that. So we have two alternate products that have some potential to serve as substitutes because perhaps the cues themselves are sufficiently rewarding that they permit substitution. So we had the following aims and hypotheses for our research. The first, we wanted to examine the ability of very low nicotine cigarettes and e-cigarettes to serve as a substitute for smokers' usual brand cigarettes compared to each other and compared to having no product. We hypothesized that VLNCs and e-cigarettes would both reduce the number of conventional cigarettes smoked compared to no study product. So having some kind of substitute would do better than having no substitute. And we thought that e-cigarettes would do better than very low nicotine cigarettes because e-cigarettes, while they only have some of the cues, they actually provide nicotine. So we thought that that would be more effective. But we also wanted to examine whether or not these effects were influenced by the presence of steady state nicotine. There are safe ways to get nicotine, and that includes the nicotine patch. And we wanted to examine whether or not cues, and again, those conditioned reinforcing cues would actually differ in their effect as a substitute, whether somebody had an active patch or a placebo patch. And we hypothesized that an active patch would enhance the ability of both very low nicotine cigarettes and e-cigarettes to serve as a substitute. So those were our primary aims and hypotheses, but we also wanted to look at moderators of effects. We wanted to look at, how much, not just how many of their usual brand cigarettes they were able to not smoke, but complete abstinence. We wanted to look at how long it was before, during people's attempts to switch, they actually went back and smoked a usual brand cigarette. We wanted to look at the proportion of replacement, to what degree were people using these alternate products. And we also wanted to understand what in real time, what were the experiences of using these products that actually promoted their use. So that's a little bit of the background and the rationale and hypotheses. And I'd like to pause now for comments and questions.
Okay, thanks, Megan. First, I will turn it over to Dr. Ukola Usidami to see if she has any questions or comments.
Sure. Thank you so much, Megan, for that very relevant research. That was a very interesting background. I just wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit more to hypothesis 2, because I thought that was interesting. So we're talking about a balance between cues and nicotine, kind of, but then you decided the study proposes that e-cigarettes might be more, a better substitute. I'm just wondering what other factors might have influenced that. It was just an interesting hypothesis to me. Can you speak a little bit more to that specific one?
Sure. So we did hypothesize that e-cigarettes would be a better substitute than very low nicotine cigarettes, because while it's not identical to the smoking experience, we thought that additional nicotine, that additional withdrawal suppressant, right? Because that's primarily what the nicotine's doing, is suppressing withdrawal, that might be in and of itself enough to help people not use their usual cigarettes. So we were thinking it might be that you needed a combination, right? That you would need a combination of a behavioral substitute plus some nicotine, and that would in fact be more effective. So that was our rationale behind that hypothesis.
Okay, thank you so much. That's very helpful. I don't have any other comments now, but I'm looking forward to the methods and the results.
Thank you. That was a great question.
Okay, there are a few questions in the Q&A, and audience members, if you have any questions, feel free to add those to the Q&A. This might be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, so feel free to defer this question to the next section. But did you provide standard NIDA e-cigarettes, or did participants use their own?
Oh, please wait for coming attractions.
Okay.
I'll let people know right now. We used a Juul e-cigarette.
Okay. All right. A question. What about other compounds in cigarette smoke like MOIA that modify the addiction effect of nicotine that is not present in other products except very low nicotine cigarettes?
Oh, that is an excellent comment. Yeah, we have to recognize that when we burn tobacco, we create 7,000 chemicals, right? And some of them do play a role in the addiction potential. So MAOI inhibitors are an important component of that experience that people have when they use combustible cigarettes. And so in a very low nicotine cigarette, it doesn't have that opportunity. The other compounds don't have the opportunity to interact with nicotine in the same way. But it is also possible that those are in there in sufficient quantities to provide some sort of pharmacologic reaction. And so that's also important to understand, what is it about the very low nicotine cigarettes, what compounds may be in that smoke that may help it serve as a substitute, in addition to the behavioral and cue-related condition reinforcer piece. So that's a great question and definitely something we need to understand more about. And hopefully as we get through the results, you'll get a little bit of, there's not going to be an answer to that, but it'll provide a little bit of insight about where to go as we ask those questions.
Okay. Have you reviewed evidence of physical activity pre-starting medications? My own work showed that PA triggers increased use of more complex changes like cessation. This is coming from Derek Yak.
Oh, that's a great question. I think that the notion of multiple behavior changes, right? Trying to, if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's how do you manage multiple behavior changes, and can they actually be used to support, the two separate changes? I have not conducted any research on increased physical activity per se, and my knowledge of the literature is somewhat limited. But I know that there's been a big push to try to combine behavior changes. Clinically, what we tend to tell people is focus on one change at a time so that we don't have, we don't get some, change fatigue happening. But I think that it is important to think about how all of, comprehensive health, right? We're talking about different types of physical health and how that may affect medication. But we also want to think about other types of health more comprehensively, social determinants of health, and how that plays out as well. And what I'm only able to focus on today is this very limited, 2-week switching experiment. But it would be interesting to know more about other people's thoughts about how increased exercise and other behavior changes might also play a role in switching.
Yeah, and if people have comments that they want to make, we'll share those with the presenter afterwards. So feel free to share your comments as well if you would like us to pass those along. A few other questions, and then we probably should move on. Here's an interesting question. Given the 20% expectation of success, which you mentioned at the start of your presentation, for long-term smoking cessation success, why doesn't the medical profession treat cigarette addiction like heroin addictions, rehab centers, group sessions?
That is a fantastic question. And it's not just the 20% success, right? It's the fact that, in the United States, almost 500,000 people die every year from smoking related diseases. Why is that not elevated to where it needs to be? And the issue is it's chronic disease, right? It's that chronic disease approach and the need to incorporate more of that, I think, into our healthcare systems in the United States. I believe, other healthcare systems do a better job of this. But it's a challenge. It's a real challenge to get resources. It's a challenge to get people to engage. Smoking has been so pervasive in our society, again, in the United States, that and now it's only happening in certain populations. And those populations tend to be those with low income, gender and racial and ethnic minority status, people with mental illness. And so I think they're not seen as much, and so they're not treated as much.
Okay, and last question, and then some other questions I think we'll save for the next segment, because I
Okay.
think you're going to be covering those. But will the e-cig and vape create other cues and conditions?
The e-cigarette would absolutely create other conditioned reinforcers, right? If you are constantly using the same cues, right? So if you have that repeated exposure of the nicotine with some external cue, let's use an example of a strawberry flavored vape. If nicotine is constantly associated with the flavor strawberry actually starts to have more rewarding properties. It in and of itself tends to become more rewarding perhaps than other flavors would. So yes, that would be how you would anticipate that to occur.
All right, thanks everybody for your questions and comments, and let's continue with your presentation.
All right, thanks. Okay, so this is the study design, and this is complicated. So I'll try to present it as clearly as I can. Mixed study means there are between subjects factors and within subjects factors. The between subject factor is which product people got as a substitute. So they either got a very low nicotine cigarette, an e-cigarette, or no product. The within subjects factor means that people were exposed to both of these. So everybody got a active nicotine patch for one switch week and a placebo patch for the other switch week. So if you look at our graphic here, you can see that in our study, which we called the options study, in options, people either got a jewel and a patch to use during switch weeks, they got a very low nicotine cigarette and a patch to use during the switch weeks, or they just got a patch. And then the content of that patch, whether it was active or placebo, varied based on the week. So this is how the study played out overall. People came in for an orientation session and they were given a smartphone app that they downloaded on their phone, or if they didn't have a phone they wanted to use, we gave them a study phone. Then a week later, during that smartphone, once we had the smartphone app, they were asked to record every single time they smoked a cigarette. And then once they got their product, the smartphone app recorded every single use event, whether it was cigarette or study product use. And they did that for the full 5 weeks. Then at week 1, they came in for a visit. And at this point, they were randomized to one of the 3 study products. And they were randomized to either get a placebo patch first or an active patch first. They then had a week to use their study product. We wanted them to get familiar. They hadn't used an e-cigarette before, to sort of feel what that felt like, to try the very low nicotine cigarettes. And so they knew what those would taste like and feel like. Then they had their very first switch week. During the switch week, they came in for 3 different visits at the beginning, middle, and end of the week, so that we could biochemically verify exposure to combustibles and to nicotine. And then we told them, please use your study product. If you have one, use it as much as you'd like. Make sure you use the study patch, put it on first thing every morning, take it off and put a new one on the next morning, and do your very best not to smoke your own cigarettes. We're really trying to see how long you can go without smoking your own cigarettes. But if you do, please let us know. So the goal was very clear, but also the goal for reporting was very clear. Then we gave people a week to smoke their own cigarettes. They still could use study product if they wanted, but they were allowed to smoke their own cigarettes. And then they had a second switch week, same thing, exact same procedure. They just had a different patch. And the patches were double blind and placebo controlled, meaning that participants didn't know whether it was an active or placebo patch. Study staff didn't know if it was an active or placebo patch. And in fact, we had assessors who were doing some of the follow-up assessments that were different because that never worked with participants, so we could maintain the double blind. What products were used? This was asked earlier. We used NIDA's reduced nicotine cigarettes that had the 0.03 milligrams of nicotine and the tar yield of 9. People were allowed to choose whether they wanted menthol or non-menthol, very low nicotine cigarettes. The e-cigarette group, Juul e-cigarette was the one that we used, and they were given 4 weeks of pods to start. Each pod has 0.7 milliliters of nicotine by volume, so that's about 5% by weight. And again, people were able to choose, did they want Virginia tobacco or menthol? They could try them and then just choose which one they wanted. They were given more pods as needed. Same with the very low nicotine cigarettes, given more packs as needed. And then for the patches, they were given 8 patches to cover each switch week. The active patch was dosed based on package insert. So if they smoked more than 10 cigarettes a day, they did the 21 milligram patch. And if it was 10 or fewer, they did 14 milligram. And as I said before, staff and participants were blind to patch type. So who was involved in the study? Who were we able to recruit? We recruited on Facebook primarily, and we had people, they had to be adults and able to read English. We didn't want people who were motivated to quit smoking. So they had no plans to quit smoking in the next 30 days. They were just willing to do these switches. They weren't currently taking any smoking cessation medications, but they were willing and able to use the patches, very low nicotine cigarettes and e-cigarettes. No current treatment for psychosis or bipolar disorder. They did have to be smoking at least 5 cigarettes a day for the last month and have an exhaled carbon monoxide or a biochemical verification of smoking that was greater than 5. And no e-cigarette use in the last month. We didn't want people who were already expert at using the product to be involved, at least not recently using the product, and then not currently pregnant or breastfeeding. Every visit they came to, we had the biomarker assessment so that we have them exhale to measure the carbon monoxide. So that'll tell us how much combustion exposure they've had. So that will help us know whether they've been using their own cigarettes or possibly a very low nicotine cigarette. We did cotinine assays using the nic check from a urine sample. And then we were also able to calculate total nicotine equivalents using the IntelliQuit app from the nic check test strip. And then we asked them to report their affect, withdrawal, craving, any adverse events they experienced. And then using timeline follow-back procedures, we were able to identify the number of cigarettes and study product used on each day prior, as well as whether they were using the patch. And as I said before, we had ecological momentary assessment as well. We asked them to record each time they either used a study product or their own cigarette. So we had real-time use data. And then for randomly selected use events, so for 3 product use events and for 3 cigarette use events, we would ask for more detailed assessment. What's going on? How are you feeling? Who are you with? And we asked some of the questions from the modified cigarette evaluation questionnaire as part of those randomly selected product use event assessments. And as I finish the methods here, this was real world research conducted in a challenging time. People in public health and in research, we've been through a very hard couple years. And so I just like to present this to give people a real world idea of what researchers are going through. Our study was funded in May of 2019. And right as we were getting ready to launch, EVALI emerged as a significant public health threat. And so we were going to give people e-cigarettes, and that was no longer possible once this risk was identified. So we had to stop and wait before we were able to restart. And originally this project was designed to offer all the Juul flavors. We were going to look at the impact of flavor as another reward that might facilitate behavioral substitution. Well, we had the Juul flavor ban in 2019, so the protocol had to be revised. We then had within our center, we had a database transition, so we had to pause and do that transition. Then in March 2020, we had the pandemic shutdown. A huge effort was made by our university and our staff to get things opened up and restarted. And we were actually able to start recruiting again in September of 2020. Then, of course, as a consequence of that, we had a furlough at our university. There was a cyber attack that shut us down. And yet we were still 3 years later able to complete participant recruitment. So that was something that we are very proud of. And I like to put this in there because it's just one of those important things to acknowledge that these data come from people during trying times. And the fact that we were still able to do this is something I'm proud of. So with that, let's stop and talk about the methods before we get into the data.
Okay, thank you. Again, we'll give our discussant the first opportunity to make questions or comments, and others feel free to add your questions, comments to the Q&A.
Thanks, Megan. Thank you so much for that. This is so interesting. I do have so many questions, but I'm going to keep them for many people. Like, for example, I'm just wondering if there's a difference between menthol cigarette smokers and menthol, those who don't smoke menthol flavor coming into the study. I'm just here thinking, would it have been different for them just because of, the menthol? I'm thinking about those who were put into the no product use category, for example. What if someone smokes like very heavily, but this was a randomization. And then they get put in the no product use, so many things. But the one I'd like to ask is, why did you select people? Well, you didn't explain, but I can imagine why you selected people who are not willing to quit. And I'm just wondering if it might have been different, because now we might be able to target those who are already on the trajectory to quit. Maybe this might have been an easier study to actually see. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that kind of that difference specifically?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point. And I think the reason that we had to use people who are not motivated to quit is if somebody did a switch week and they practiced quitting, so to speak, for a week, and then we said, now please return to smoking. I think there are ethical and treatment concerns about having people go back to their prior use and then trying another switch week. And so I think this is sort of a step before actually working with people who are motivated to quit. We need to know in people who aren't motivated, is this something that might actually work as a behavioral substitute? If it is, then we could think about trying it as something that would help, be a tool for supporting a cessation attempt in addition to evidence-based cessation treatment. But this is sort of that first study. And in order to have that within subjects design where they do it twice, we have to have people being willing to not smoke and then not smoke again.
Thank you so much. You have so many questions, so I'll just turn it over to Mike too, so we can get to as many questions as possible. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Let's see. So, question: we know that we don't know the levels of nicotine in e-cigarettes like Juul, as they are not regulated. How did you handle this, as nicotine levels can vary by manufacturer?
Right. This is a huge issue, right? When you're doing e-cigarette research, the e-cigarettes themselves are so highly variable, which is one of the reasons that we chose Juul, because Juul has been more consistently, I would say, it's not regulated, but I would say it's been more consistently evaluated that it's around 5%. And given that it's being manufactured by the tobacco industry, that is more used to regulating things as opposed to something that might be from a smaller e-cigarette company where they may have fewer quality control things in place. That was one of our rationales, was we were going to keep at least a consistent product. It may not be 5% nicotine, but it's what's available in the market. And it was something that was, again, at the time that this grant was written and the study was funded, it was a very popular product. People were using it a lot, and it seemed like a reasonable substitution tool that people could use if this were shown to be helpful.
How do you compare the nicotine content in an e-cigarette to a cigarette? It is hard to find information on how many cigarettes equal one vape, since the nicotine levels vary by manufacturer and type. Thoughts?
Yes, I agree. This is really, really complicated. Juul says basically one pod is approximately equal to the amount of nicotine in a single or in a pack of cigarettes, rather. But it's a real challenge, and this is definitely not my area of expertise. There are other folks that are doing a much better job of rigorously quantifying the nicotine in e-cigarettes and how that compares to the nicotine in combustible cigarettes. So I'm afraid I don't have much to add to that.
Yep. How do you measure e-cigarette use quantity?
This is another great measurement challenge in doing e-cigarette research, right? When you measure cigarettes, I smoked a cigarette because I smoked it all down and then it was done, or I decided I'd smoked enough and I was done. It's a finite use event. With e-cigarettes, what we try to do is to say, okay, it's about, 10 puffs or 10 to 15 minutes of a use event. But we recognize that there's a real problem in doing that, because not everybody treats an e-cigarette like a cigarette. You don't go out for an e-cigarette break, vape for a certain period of time, and then come back. A lot of people take 2 hits, they put it away, take another 2, put it away. And so what we try to say is a use event was defined by us as, 10 to 15 puffs every 10 to 15 minutes, or puff events separated by 10 to 15 minutes of not puffing.
We're going to go back and take two questions from introduction material, and then
Sure.
I think we can move on. There was one comment and then a follow-up question about throat hit, which you referred to in your introduction material. So I guess the question is there published literature about the physiology or source of throat hit as referred to in comments that were made by the previous comment?
That is a great question. And off the top, there probably is, and I'm not aware of it off the top of my head. My experience has been anecdotal, hearing from people and talking about how the throat hit itself is driven primarily by the nicotine. Yeah, if anyone else has a reference that they could share, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, and I think people, they can, if they want to continue discussing this in the answered part of the Q&A, you can put comments to the answered questions, and then Megan will have all that information at the end of her presentation. One final introduction related question: won't MAOI from very low nicotine cigarettes interact with the nicotine provided by NRT in dual use?
In dual use. So we addressed the MAOI question earlier, but now the question is specific to dual use.
Would interact with nicotine provided by NRT in dual use? I think so. Yes.
Okay. I guess I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, that's fine. All right, please continue with your presentation.
Okay. And if whoever asked that question wants to ask it again, I'm happy to tackle it. I'm sorry for not tracking. Okay, so let's look at the results. So we had, over our 3 years of recruitment, we had 2,000 total volunteers that responded to our ads. Of those, 25% were able to screen pass. And of those who screened passed, we were able to randomize 41%, so a total of 209 participants. And then we were included in the analyses, 54 people in the e-cigarette group, 53 people in the no product group, and 53 people in the VLNC group. These are the folks who actually completed both switching events. Because this was an experimental study, we needed people to go through both the active and placebo patch switches to be included in our final analyses. So of those 160 participants, they were about 52 years old. I should note that of the, we randomized 209 and only analyzed 160, but the groups were very similar with one exception. The withdrawn participants tended to be younger. They were about 47 on average. With respect to gender distribution, you can see we had more than half women. You can see the racial distribution, 22% were identified as African American or Black, 71% white, and 1% American Indian or Alaskan Natives, and 4% multiple races. 3% identified as Hispanic, and you can see the sexual orientation distribution. And almost 2 in 3 participants reported some history of diagnosis or treatment for mental illness. With respect to smoking, they were smoking not quite a pack a day on average and had a baseline carbon monoxide of 20. The cotinine and the total nicotine equivalents are listed there. They were not particularly motivated to quit smoking, which is exactly what we wanted. We didn't want people to somehow get sidetracked on a smoking cessation attempt as part of the study. The FTCD, the Fagerstrom test of cigarette dependence score, was almost 5, and a little bit more than half of our participants smoked menthol cigarettes. So let's talk about what happened when we gave them the products. We didn't have a lot of product use in that first lead-in week. People on average, 1 to 2 events per day, 1 to 2 variable nicotine cigarettes per day, or vape events. And again, it was about 15 minutes, 15 puffs, or about 10 minutes was considered, by our definition, a vape event. But for the most part, we let people, people are going to tell us what they consider to be a vape event. During the switch weeks, we did have higher use, so almost, but about 9 to 10 VLNCs were used per day and about 7 vape events per day. We should note that there was a decline, a statistically significant decline during the second switch week. People may have started using the product, but they really did decline during that second switch week. But the only significant effect was the patch effect. During the placebo switch week, people used significantly more of their replacement product or their alternate product than they did during the active switch week, which we would expect to see. They might need a little bit more when they don't have active nicotine in their system supporting the switch. So how did we test our hypotheses? We used a repeated measures ANOVA, but our primary outcome for this research was number of usual brand cigarettes smoked during that switch week. That was zero inflated, so we added baseline cigarettes per day as a covariate, and that was able to normalize the distribution of the residuals. We did find one significant main effect. So we tested the main effect of product, the main effect of patch, and then the interaction between patch and product. Product was significant, but there was no effect for patch or the patch and product interaction. So what that looks like is on the y-axis, this is the mean usual brand cigarettes smoked per day. And then we have the different groups, e-cigarette, very low nicotine cigarette, and no product group. And the red bars are during the active week and the blue bars are during the placebo switch week. You can see that the e-cigarettes and very low nicotine cigarettes are significantly lower. They had significantly fewer of their own cigarettes smoked compared to people with no product. But there doesn't seem to be much effect of patch, and then there's no interaction. So when we evaluate our hypotheses, the first hypothesis was that very low nicotine cigarettes and e-cigarettes would reduce the number of conventional cigarettes smoked, and that was supported. We can see that. The no product group smoked significantly more of their own cigarettes than the other two groups. But we also thought the e-cigarettes would do a better job as being a substitute compared to very low nicotine cigarettes, and that was not the case. And then finally, we thought that active patch would certainly support the ability of these two different products to serve as a substitute. And once again, patch status, active nicotine did not support substitution. We wanted to make sure that these effects were consistent across various moderators. We looked at age, race, sexual orientation, education, mental illness with a variety of markers, menthol use, and time to first cigarette. And the one moderator we found was age. So again, this is a similar graph where estimated cigarettes per day of their usual brand smoked is on that y-axis. We have the 3 different study product groups, and then we've got the 4 age groups. So the gray bars are the youngest groups, the 24 to 40s, the blue are the 41 to 59, and the red are the 60 to 74. And what you can see here is when you compare the no product group to the other groups, you can really see that those red bars, the people in the oldest group of our population, the oldest quartile, those folks are smoking significantly more of their own cigarettes if they don't have a behavioral substitute. Conversely, there's no actual difference between the, you don't see the same effect, I should say, in the other 2 age groups. We wanted to look at some other outcomes to try to understand more fully how this effect is actually playing out. So we looked at the proportion of people who were actually able to abstain for an entire switch week. They reported that they did not smoke any of their usual cigarettes. During the active patch week, you can see that the e-cigarette abstinence rate, that group was a little bit higher, but than the VLNC group, but there's no difference there. And then the no product group was about half that. But within the placebo patch switch weeks, actually, for whatever reason, more than a quarter of the e-cigarette groups were able to, or reported abstaining completely, compared to only 11% for the other 2 product groups. When it comes to how long did it take somebody to actually use their usual brand cigarette? So these are survival curves. And what you can see here is that the hazard ratio, well, first of all, you can see that most people went back to or had a usual brand cigarette within the first day, right? So only 30% of the e-cigarette group was able to not smoke a usual brand cigarette, and that these curves are very parallel. And what we see is that there is actually a statistically significant difference that the no product group uses their own cigarettes faster than either of the other 2 groups, but the other 2 groups do not differ. One other outcome we looked at was proportion of switching. So were people doing a 1-to-1 switch? When they would normally smoke a usual brand cigarette, did they instead use a VLNC or an e-cigarette? So we examined the mean daily product use during the switch weeks divided by the mean baseline cigarettes per day to sort of look at a proportion of switching or a proportion of replacement. We did find a significant main effective patch. So during placebo weeks, there was a 59% replacement versus an active patch week when there was only a 53% replacement. So people were indeed using more of their products when they had a placebo patch than combustible, which is consistent with our prior results that I looked at. And then we did find a main effective product that people in the VLNC group were doing much more replacement, many more use events compared to those in the e-cigarette group. And so that's important. And again, that might have something to do with the fact that it's a finite product, right? So it's a one-to-one, it's a clear replacement, or that the e-cigarette, for whatever reason was perhaps not as, people were not using it as much as they would have normally been using their regular cigarettes. And then we wanted to look at why might people be using these alternate products? What might be driving this use? So we used our ecological momentary assessment data from the app. We had 37, almost 38,000 total use events and about 11,000 use contexted assessments. And what we tried to look at were what was going on, what were the factors that were associated with somebody reporting that they were either smoking a very low nicotine cigarette or vaping an e-cigarette. And we looked specifically at the cigarette expectancy questionnaire or cigarette evaluation questionnaire items. So we looked at smoking or vaping satisfaction, how psychologically rewarding was it, what kind of aversive experiences did people have, how much did they enjoy the sort of respiratory tract sensations when they were inhaling, and then how much did it reduce their craving for cigarettes. The only predictors of use were vaping satisfaction and smoking satisfaction. And that, for whatever reason, only happened during active patch weeks. So still exploring what that means, but what it's telling us is that it's the satisfaction that seems to be key in helping people be interested in using a substitute product. So before I get to the conclusions, we really have to talk about limitations, right? We want to make sure we're drawing conclusions but recognizing the limitations of the experimental paradigm in the study that was conducted. First of all, as was brought up earlier, participants are not motivated to quit smoking. We don't know how this will translate when people are actually trying to quit and are motivated beyond just, hey, we've asked you not to smoke for 7 days. Second, we only ask people to switch for 7 days. It might be that this effect is something that occurs early, but later on, there's no difference between the groups or the products no longer serve as substitutes. The taste of the very low nicotine cigarettes was not reinforcing. I heard that from all the staff. Oh, participants do not like these cigarettes. They do not taste good. And so if taste is a major driver it's a major cue that's a secondary reinforcer, then VLNCs do have somewhat limited ability to serve as a substitute. And then finally, we did have limited racial and sexual orientation diversity. So it's not possible to do well-powered tests of some important group differences. But what can we draw? With those caveats in mind, what conclusions can we draw? We know that nicotine delivery devices like e-cigarettes and non-nicotine smoking cue devices like very low nicotine cigarettes both significantly reduce the number of cigarettes that people smoke. And they are similar in their ability to substitute for participants' usual cigarettes. We learned that a steady state nicotine from the active patch actually doesn't seem to help people refrain from smoking their usual cigarettes, no matter what product they were assigned to. And we also learned then that behavioral factors, in addition to the nicotine dependence, play a key role in sustaining smoking behavior. And this is especially true for older smokers. So because of that, there's a need for us to think about how to address the impact of smoking cues, specifically the lighting up, the inhaling, the taste, all of those things as part of smoking cessation treatment, and especially for older smokers. It could be that older smokers, folks who have been smoking for decades and who have then developed lots of conditioned reinforcers over that time, it's especially important for them to have some sort of substitute to allow them to maintain a switch or to actually quit smoking their regular usual brand combustible cigarettes. We also learned that product satisfaction plays a key role. So we need to think about how appealing substitutes are. And then one of the key issues we still have to disentangle is the role of nicotine from specific behavioral features and cues associated with substitution, right? So the products do equally well. Well, a very low nicotine cigarette is still exposing you to combustion and all of those related health consequences. An e-cigarette may have reduced risk, but it also has the nicotine. What would it do as a replacement product without the nicotine? And so that, I think, is something that there's been a lot of research on the role of flavors and the role of nicotine per se in e-cigarettes, but I feel like that's something that needs further exploration. So with that, I would just like to convey my enormous gratitude to the entire study team. This would not have been possible without their contributions. Again, they went in as soon as we could safely. They had all sorts of extensive safety precautions so that they could do this in the midst of the COVID pandemic. And I'm so very grateful for all of their dedicated work. And with that, I'll open it for the final questions and comments section.
Sounds great. I'll turn it over to discussant for any concluding questions, comments.
Hi, Megan. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to keep it short. And not questions because I just want to question, but it was really a very insightful study. The first thing is, VLNCs, do they have flavors? I was just curious.
They just come in menthol and tobacco.
But you didn't use any menthol for the study, right?
They did. People could choose. They could, if they wanted menthol, they could have menthol. If they wanted tobacco, they could have tobacco. If they wanted to try them both and pick one, they could do that.
Okay, because you said that was one of the major things, the taste. So I was like, maybe if VMS is hard taste anyway. The other thing was, if someone wants to do this, for example, for diversity purposes, maybe you have a more diverse population, but then you want to replicate something you did. What if you were to do it, what would you advise them to rethink in terms of recruitment? Because you had a lot of younger people drop. So could it be incentives, or what kind of thing would you have advised maybe some other researchers, when next you're doing this, try to do this, or things like that, to retain younger people for the study?
Yeah, that's a challenge, I think, for all research studies. And I would love other people's thoughts on how they retain their samples too. Sometimes, I think we do our best to be flexible in terms of our scheduling, so we can schedule outside traditional work hours. We do our best to, provide sufficient financial incentive without going too far, so it becomes sort of coercive for people with low income. But I think that, dropout, especially dropout among younger participants, tends to be fairly common for our studies. And I think part of it may just have to do with life demands. That they just have more personal demands, professional demands, and research drops out. But I think that would be a great study. And if anyone has any research to share on how to keep people engaged in research, so that we don't have sort of an unusual unicorn sample to draw our conclusions from, that would be fantastic to share.
Especially younger people.
Yes.
And week 1, were they allowed to use their product in addition to trying out the new products in
Yes.
the first week?
Yes. In that first week, they could smoke as much of their own cigarettes, and then they could use as much of the product as they wanted.
Okay, because there was a jump from that week 1 for so that explains it. But overall, I'll just turn it right back to Mike. Thank you so much for an opportunity to discuss this research with you. It was very interesting and insightful. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for your questions and comments.
So audience questions, I think you covered this, but you mentioned that both menthol and non-mentholated were available. Was that for the very low nicotine cigarettes or for the e-cigarettes? Okay, great.
That was for both. We
Okay.
wanted to make sure we had menthol flavoring available for both products for people who preferred, menthol. Typically we're menthol smokers.
Okay. How do you explain the very low daily cigarettes reported by the no product group? I realize that is significantly higher than in the 2 product groups, but it's less than half of the originally reported cigarettes per day.
That's a great question. And I think if I think about it, first of all, I think when people are willing to engage in a research study, they tend to try to do the best thing that they can. And when we've asked them to try not to smoke, they tried. They did the best they could. I think also knowing that they had a patch on, and whether they knew it was active or placebo, that may have supported the notion that, well, there's something helping me, hopefully, so maybe I can do a better job of not smoking my own cigarettes. And I think the third factor that may have played a role is it's a finite time. It's not a quit attempt. It's not thinking like you'll never smoke again. It's just for these 7 days, I've agreed to do this thing to help these researchers. I can do it for 7 days.
What happened to total consumption, i.e. conventional Sig Plus product? Looking at the graph, it looks like overall consumption went up in the intervention groups. Is that the case?
Looking at the graph, it looks like overall consumption went up. I'm going to go back to the graph. So people smoked on average 16 cigarettes per day. And so they used between 3 and 6 cigarettes of their own per day. But then if they used, let's say they used 3 VLNCs and then or 3 of their own cigarettes, and then they also used 10 VLNCs, they'd still be below the mean. So I guess, and one of the things we watched for people was overuse, over smoking, specifically with the VLNC group. And we had almost no, I think there was one person that ended up over smoking past our safety threshold. But for the most part, I would say people were not using more product than they would have initially on average. I have not looked at whether or not certain people ended up using more product. That would be a good thing for us to look at.
Okay. Did research decide, or did the participant decide on which day of the week they start alternate, or their own brand in the keep weekly cycle?
The participants set their own date, the time, which day they wanted to do it. This was the sort of scheduling challenge, right? Because they had to come in 3 to 4, they had to come in the middle. And so we couldn't necessarily do it on Fridays because people couldn't come in on Mondays. So they worked with the staff to figure out when they could come in for the first day of the switch week, the middle of the week, and the end of the week within our time parameters. So it was done collaboratively with the participant.
Okay. You accredited health counselors at the end. What was their role? Was there an active behavioral counseling component in study arms?
Great question. Health counselors are what we call our direct service staff here at our center. And so there was no specific treatment. People are like, oh, it's really hard. My cravings are terrible. And our health counselors had to say, that is really hard. Thanks for doing all the work and recording the data. We really appreciate it. But the health counselors' jobs were to conduct the the different assays, the carbon, to get the CO breath samples, to get the urine samples, to conduct, to give people the assessments, to do the timeline follow-back assessments of product use. So they were basically our data collectors and our engagement experts, trying to keep people involved in the study as best we could.
Okay, and I think one final question, kind of more of a conceptual question. Actually, we got this early in the presentation. I saved it for the end. This is not on you, but why has the smoking cessation research community not engaged more in research on controlled psychedelic use for quitting smoking? Why instead do researchers keep researching the same old quit aids like NRT and more recently e-cigarettes that show only a moderate increase in quitting in clinical settings and not at all or extremely minimally in the real world at the population level?
I think this is a great question. I think they're studying using psychedelics to support smoking cessation is being done. There are people doing that. It requires a highly specialized methodology and requires, it's getting started. I think I'll say that it's getting started, and I don't know how far it will go or how quickly it will take off. I think psychedelic treatment has a lot of ground to make up based on popular understanding of how psychedelics work and how they've been abused in the past. So I think that's going to be a challenge for that research in terms of making it into mainstream treatment options. So, but there are people that are definitely doing that work, and some of that research looks promising. I think folks in the smoking cessation treatment world, we're trying to figure out the optimal ways to use the tools that we have, because we haven't had any new tools for a long time with respect to medications. And with respect to counseling and behavioral treatment, you know, there are some folks doing some outstanding work on specific types of counseling, but there's still more that we need to know. And counseling is hard. It's hard to get people to engage. It's hard in sustaining counseling in terms of participation. But you know, we're working with the tools we have, and that's why I think this issue of substitution and thinking about the conditioned reinforcement of all of the cues associated with drug delivery is another, you know, it's not a miracle cure, but it's another piece of the puzzle that we might be able to leverage more effectively.
Okay, thanks for a very engaging presentation, Dr. Piper. And I'll turn it over to our MC to take us out the door.
Thank you. We are out of time. However, if you still have burning questions or thoughts for Dr. Piper, you can join us for Top of the Tops, an interactive group discussion offered immediately following Select Tops event this season. To join, please copy the Zoom meeting room URL posted in the chat and switch rooms with us once this event concludes. Thank you to our presenter, moderator, and discussant. Finally, thank you to the audience of 225 people for your participation. Have a top-notch weekend. Thank you.